Christians have debated the millennium for really 2,000 years. The millennium is referred to only one time in the Bible, in Revelation chapter 20. There we read about a 1,000-year period. The three main views that are out there are post-millennialism, premillennialism, and amillennialism. In postmillennialism, Christ will come to reign on earth after a golden age. The word post means after the millennium, after the 1,000 years. Postmillennialists, however, do not typically interpret the 1,000 years literally. So they understand the 1,000 years in a symbolic way. So for some postmillennialists, the millennium began right when Christ was raised from the dead. That 1,000 years is interpreted symbolically, obviously, since we've had around 2,000 years that have passed. Other postmillennialists think that the millennium begins at a certain point of time. But again, it doesn't have to be 1,000 years. In the postmillennial scheme, because of the preaching of the gospel, the world gets better. The world is improved by the proclamation of the gospel. Many Puritans believed in postmillennialism. Yeah, a nice, handy way to read about postmillennialism today is in a book by Ian Murray called The Puritan Hope. So he explains the postmillennial view. Postmillennialists today, you have theonomists are typically postmillennial. Maybe a well-known person who's postmillennial is Doug Wilson. But in the main, postmillennialism isn't very popular today. It's not really a view held by very many. It's a minority view. I think there's some exegetical problems with it. I think one of the exegetical problems is there are, I think, indications in the New Testament that there's a period of declension before Christ returns instead of things getting better. If you read Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 21, postmillennialists typically take that passage when Jesus is riding on the white horse to refer to the progress of the gospel throughout this age. So things are getting better and better as the gospel is proclaimed. But I think that passage is much more naturally interpreted, as most people interpret it, to refer to the second coming of Jesus. So we could talk about postmillennialism for a long time, but I'm not going to talk about it further since it isn't a view that a lot of people are espousing today. So the two views that are more popular today are premillennialism and amillennialism. So premillennialism, pre and then millennial, premillennialism teaches that Christ comes physically and bodily to earth, and he reigns on this earth for 1,000 years. So in postmillennialism, remember, Christ comes to earth after the 1,000 years, or at the end of the 1,000 years, after this golden age on earth. But in premillennialism, he comes before the 1,000 years, and he reigns on earth for these 1,000 years. Most premillennialists believe that the 1,000 years are literal. But actually, you don't have to believe that to be a premillennialist. You could understand that 1,000 years to be symbolic of a significant period of time. So you would still be premillennial. You would still believe that Christ is reigning personally and visibly on earth. There are also different stripes of premillennialism. You have historic premillennialism. It's called historic premillennialism because some of the early church fathers were premillennialists of this sort. That includes church fathers like Irenaeus, Papias, Justin Martyr, and others. So these are church fathers who lived in the early centuries of the church, and when we read them, it's clear that they're premillennialist. But another stripe of premillennialist that's very popular, especially in the United States, is dispensational premillennialism. That dispensational scheme understands the millennium in terms of the dispensations, and especially in dispensationalism, there's a strong separation between Israel and the church. So in the dispensational understanding, Jesus reigns from Jerusalem, and Israel has a very special place in the millennium. God rules the world through Israel. So the nation of Israel has a prominent place in the millennium. So there are many dispensational premillennialists, there are historic premillennialists. And now I'll say a word about amillennialism. Amillennialism is really not the best title because amillennialism literally means no millennium. You really can't believe in the Bible and not believe there's a millennium, because Revelation 20 is clear there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So a better term for this is amillennialism. Maybe that's the name premillennialists gave it or postmillennialists gave it, but amillennialists believe in a realized millennium. That the millennium is taking place now. So in the amillennial understanding, the millennium begins at the resurrection of Christ. The number 1,000 years is clearly symbolic. And most amillennialists believe that Christ is reigning in heaven with the souls of those who are Christians. So believers are reigning in heaven in their intermediate state. Before they're raised from the dead, they're reigning with Christ in heaven during this 1,000-year period. And this 1,000-year period will culminate with the coming of Jesus Christ. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these two views, the premillennial view and the amillennial view. We won't get into the details of dispensational or historic premillennialism. Yeah, but good arguments can be made for both. It's a really difficult issue. I'm thankful most Christians today don't think this is an issue we should divide on, and I'm in complete agreement with that. I think it's too difficult of an issue to divide over. Furthermore, it's not that important. I mean, we're interested in it, but it shouldn't be an issue that we break fellowship over. And I think most believers agree with that today. So arguments in favor of premillennialism, if you consider Revelation 20. Well, one of the arguments is in Revelation 19, verses 11 through 21. Jesus comes on the white horse. He returns. He destroys his enemies. He throws the false prophet and the beast into hell. And then Revelation 20 opens, and John says, and I saw, and then in this passage, the angel comes and throws Satan into the abyss, into the pit, for 1,000 years. And premillennialists argued, look, we have a sequence here. First, in Revelation 19, Jesus returns and destroys the beast and the false prophet and the enemies, the human enemies allied with that. And then in Revelation 20, we have a new event where the angel takes hold of Satan and puts him in the abyss for 1,000 years. So that's one argument. Another argument in favor of premillennialism is that in Revelation chapter 12, Satan is cast down to the earth. So he's thrown to the earth when he has that big battle with Michael, but he's still active on earth. Whereas in Revelation 20, he's put into the abyss. So what premillennialists say, it's in a very good argument. Look, in Revelation 12, he's cast down to the earth, but he's still active on earth. But in Revelation 20, he's thrown into the abyss, and the abyss is locked, and it's sealed, and he doesn't disturb people for 1,000 years. And they say those are two distinct events. This sealing and locking of Satan into the abyss or the pit, they'll say that just hasn't happened yet, which leads to a third argument. It's really quite similar. Right now, Satan is the god of this world. He's the prince of the power of the air. Right now, he's still deceiving people. He's deceiving nations. But Revelation 20 says he's locked in the abyss and that he can't deceive the nations anymore. So premillennialists say, obviously, that hasn't happened yet. Satan's still deceiving the nations. So we have not yet seen this 1,000-year period where Satan is locked into the abyss and he's not deceiving the nations. A fourth really good argument for the premillennial view is John talks about these martyrs in Revelation chapter 20. And John says they came to life and they reigned for 1,000 years. And the argument is that that verb, they came to life, means they are raised from the dead. You can look in chapter 2. We have the same word that is used in terms of Jesus himself. And clearly it means Jesus was raised from the dead. And more than this, so you have these martyrs who come to life, who are raised to life, resurrected in the premillennial view, and they reign for 1,000 years. And then 1,000 years later, the rest come to life. Same verb. So there's a sequence. 1,000 years pass, the rest come to life. Even amillennialists argue that the rest coming to life includes the physical resurrection. So that's very interesting, isn't it? The first verb, the martyrs come to life and reign for 1,000 years. Premillennialists say that's a physical resurrection. Amillennialists don't think that first resurrection is a physical resurrection. But the next statement, and 1,000 years later, the rest come to life, and they argue that includes a physical resurrection. So this is a little bit complicated, but premillennialists say, I think the argument overall is simple. Premillennialists say, look, the verb means the same thing. In both cases, it refers to a physical resurrection. So that's the fourth argument. There's a literal physical resurrection. Fifth argument, if this passage is not talking about a literal physical resurrection, Revelation never mentions the physical resurrection of believers specifically. And that seems really strange in a book that's talking about the end times. Sixth argument, I mean, there's more. We could go on this forever, right? But the sixth and final argument, that first resurrection that I talked about, the martyrs who come to life, right? John comments on that a verse later, and he says, this is the first resurrection. So that word, resurrection there, anastasis, N.T. Wright wrote a book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. What Wright argues in this book is that the word anastasis always refers to physical resurrection. Always. Interestingly enough, though, Wright argues that, but when he comes to Revelation 20, he says, well, actually, it doesn't mean that here. It doesn't mean physical resurrection here. This is an exception. But the premillennialists can rightly say, well, wait a minute. It means this in every other case. It must mean the same thing here. The burden of proof is on anyone who would say the word doesn't have that meaning. So, premillennialism, whether historic or dispensational, we can argue about that, but it has some great arguments in favor of it. And maybe I hope you're even convinced by it, hearing it. I hope you hear, wow, those are great arguments. But what about amillennialism? So I would actually say I slightly, uncertainly, tentatively, haltingly, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, more than that actually, I tend towards amillennialism. But it's a very difficult issue, and I don't feel certain about it, and I wish I actually had more certainty about it. But what are the arguments in favor of amillennialism? So the first argument is, nowhere else in Scripture do we read about this 1,000-year reign of Christ. And it's simpler to say the second coming and the last judgment take place at the same time. Because if you're a premillennialist, right, you have the resurrection of the saints and the second coming separated by 1,000 years. So that's possible, but that's not as neat and clean. So in the amillennial scheme is cleaner. Jesus comes, the dead are raised, it's the last judgment. You go into the new heavens and the new earth, Revelation 21 and 22. So that's the first argument. It's simple and it's clean. You don't see the millennium spoken of anywhere else. Second argument, and this one is very interesting, a little bit harder to understand, but Old Testament texts that are regularly appealed to in defense of premillennialism. So I'm talking about texts like Isaiah 60, Ezekiel 40 through 48, the rebuilding of the temple. We can just use those as examples. There are other passages. Those texts that are regularly understood by premillennialists to refer to the millennium are not mentioned or alluded to at all in Revelation 20. But in a most fascinating way, when we read Revelation 21 and 22, those texts are all over the place. You have many allusions to Isaiah chapter 60 and Ezekiel 40 through 48, the rebuilding of the temple. But Revelation 21 and 22 is talking about the new creation. So, I think that's a problem for the premill view. With a literal hermeneutic, they say, look, these passages are going to be fulfilled in the millennium. So you have a so-called literal building of the temple. But John says in Revelation 21 and 22, in the new creation, there is no temple. And yet that's the passage where it has many allusions to Ezekiel 40 through 48. So I think that's a problem from the premillennial view. The so-called passages in the Old Testament that supposedly support premillennialism, they're not in Revelation 20, they're in the new creation text. Thirdly, what about Revelation 20 itself? What about the argument that you have a sequence? In chapter 19, verses 11 through 21, Jesus returns. Then the next event in Revelation 20 is that Satan is thrown into the abyss by the angel. I mean, of course, that's possible. But you could also argue that what we have here is recapitulation. One of the features of Revelation is recursive, or it recapitulates, retells the same events from different perspectives. And it's a very interesting thing here because in Revelation 19, John alludes to Ezekiel 38 and 39, but he also alludes to Ezekiel 38 and 39 in Revelation 20 in the judgment of Satan. And I would argue, along with Dan Block, who I think wrote the best commentary out there on Ezekiel, Dan argues that the judgments in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are the same judgment told from different perspectives. Do you see my point here? My point is the judgment in Revelation 19, appealing to Ezekiel 38 and 39, and the judgment in Revelation 20, appealing to Ezekiel 38 and 39, are referring to the same account, the same story, just from different perspectives. So it isn't so clear that we have a sequence here. It could be the same event. You shake up the kaleidoscope, but it's the same event told from a different perspective. I think that's more likely. So, fourth argument, what about the fact that Satan is thrown into the abyss and he can no longer deceive the nations? Again, I want to say the premillennial argument is very good, and maybe it's right, but I think there's a good answer to that. And I think the answer is, we remember when it says Satan is cast to the earth and Satan is cast into the abyss, we have to remember we're dealing with apocalyptic language. We have to be careful not to overly literalize either of those visions. So what is the point of both of those visions? Are they harmonious? And I would actually argue they refer to the same period of time. That is, the period after Jesus' death and resurrection. So Satan is bound and put into the pit for 1,000 years, but Matthew chapter 12, Jesus says he has come to bind the strong man, which is clearly Satan. So I think if we look at Matthew chapter 12, that binding of Satan is understood to have taken place in Jesus' ministry through his cross and resurrection. That can be pictured, Revelation 12, as Satan being cast to the earth. And it can be pictured as Satan being cast into the abyss. But what about the point? Satan can't deceive the nations. Isn't he deceiving the nations? But I think all Mills have a good reply to that. And the reply is this, that in the Old Covenant, God's special people was Israel, and the gospel was not going out to the nations. Satan was deceiving the nations virtually completely, comprehensively, totally. So amillennialists are not arguing that Satan is not doing any work of deception now. I think he is. But Revelation 20 is speaking specifically to the issues, is Satan deceiving the nations as a whole so they're not hearing the gospel? And the answer is no. In this present evil age, the gospel is going to the ends of the earth, and some from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation are believing. So Satan is bound in the sense that he's no longer preventing the nations, as in the Old Testament, from hearing the gospel. Fifth argument, what about the statement that the martyrs came to life and reigned for 1,000 years, which I'm going to mix this together with, and John's saying this is the first resurrection. Maybe I'll talk about that last part first. Remember what I said about N.T. Wright. Anastasis, the word resurrection, always refers to a physical resurrection. And then Wright says, but it doesn't in Revelation 20. And some people say, well, he's basically cheating. But I think Wright could be correct here. I actually think he is correct. I mean, why would he even say that? I think the answer is we're dealing with apocalyptic literature. The terms take their meaning and context. And so we have to be careful when we're talking about apocalyptic, and especially the way the book of Revelation is written, over-literalizing the use of a term. So I would argue that first resurrection is spiritual. It is the reign of believers in heaven with Christ. That's the first resurrection. And that is the sense that John has in mind when he says they came to life. Yes, there is a second coming to life where it's physical. But Meredith Kline has made a very interesting argument here in regard to these things that I think is helpful. Meredith Kline says there's a first resurrection, which implies there's a second resurrection. The first resurrection is spiritual. That second resurrection is physical. And John speaks of a second death. The second death is hell. But there's a first death, isn't there? There's a first death where people do not know God in this life. And we're all born into the first death, so to speak. But the decisive issue is, do you experience the second death? So you see the parallel here? First resurrection means you have spiritual life. First death, spiritual death. Second resurrection, physical resurrection. Second death, physical resurrection, and life in hell. So I think that's a good amillennial answer. This debate will go on. I haven't solved it today. Good believers will continue to disagree. We pray for more light from God's word. But meanwhile, we recognize that we all need humility. We need to show love to one another. We need to be generous to one another. And it's fine to have strong convictions as well. I think strong convictions can coexist with love at the same time. But we also need to remember that we agree on the main things, that Jesus is coming back. I mean, that's the main thing, right? Jesus wins. Righteousness triumphs. Those who resist the Lord will be punished. The devil doesn't finally win. I mean, that's John's main point. So we can get involved in this debate and we can actually miss the most glorious truth of all, whichever view is right, the righteous triumph. God is going to bring peace to this earth. There's a new creation coming, and we are going to see God's face and enjoy him forever.